TimBurnette is the founder and core curator of The Way Collective, a new movement in Santa Barbara, California, and a community for people looking to unite by living well for the common good in an increasingly divisive world.
Hi there, my name is Cameron Trimble. I'm the CEO of Convergence, and I am honored to be in conversation with TimBurnette. Did I get that right? Burnette?
You got it.
Okay,
nailed it.
Very good. I barely remember my own name, so it's good that I always check on these things. Tim, you are up to a very cool thing called The Way Collective, which we want to hear about. But tell us about you and about what you're up to.
Yeah, I am here in Santa Barbara, California, helping catalyze a movement of folks around this idea of building community around shared practices and values rather than beliefs. I'm a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I'm a process philosopher and theologian, interested in the contemplative streams of Christianity and trying to bring all of that together in charting a new way forward for spiritual community. And so we're having a blast, creating this new space. It's very, we meet weekly for dinner and dialogue. And so very dinner churchy inspired, but also trying to sort of decolonize some of our inherited models of gathering together and to flatten power structures and also sort of like create a setting for more mutuality and conversation instead of sort of the historic kind of inherited top-down teaching, worship-centric sort of spiritual community model. So we're learning all the time. We're trying to innovate, but it's a process of growth for those of us who are trying to acclimate to a new format for community for today. But we're having fun experimenting all the while. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, I was doing some research about the community, about what you've been up to in preparation for this conversation. And I decided that I live way too far away, but I totally would want to be a member of your church or your collective. I guess would be a better language for it. How did you get, when did you wake up and say, okay, this is really needed in the world, this different way of being? What happened that invited you and you said yes to it?
Well, there's a longer story there, obviously, but that has a beginning to it. But I would say that my experience in sort of different Western Christian settings, I grew up in a very sort of Bible-believing kind of church. My dad was a minister in one of those kinds of churches. And then I went to a Pentecostal undergraduate liberal arts school for college. And then I worked in the PCUSA for almost 9 years. But all of those, varying forms of Christianity were still very Western and white. And so my experience was, as I was learning and growing and kind of in grad school at the time, having that sort of ideological deconstruction that accompanies trying to integrate new ideas, I also had this existential experience of getting diagnosed with cancer at a young age while I was in grad school. And so I had this ideological integration happening as I started to ask more deep existential questions about finitude and mortality. And, the theology I had inherited had certain kinds of responses. And I also didn't find those adequate and needed some new conversation partners. And so really quickly, I came to find some wonderful conversation partners, some of whom are, I think, also voices in this online gathering. But through that process, I came to hold very nuanced and brand new to me convictions really quickly. And so what I realized was the spaces I was occupying in terms of even my church location, my seminary location, and those kinds of conversation circles weren't really conducive to continue to equip me to go where I felt like I was, being expanded to go. And through that process, I sort of was diffused from those forms of Christianity that we're still wanting to sort of hold together, bounded belief set type communities. And like right away, my experience of being diffused out of evangelicalism really was what it was one in which I sort of innately knew that we needed a new kind of space because I hadn't seen it in many of the church formats that I had been a part of. And so, trying to make it was one thing. And then again, we're sort of gravitated towards what kinds of formats of gathering would be helpful for folks who want to take certain sets of practices really seriously. So for us, it became for me a way to name the space that was needed was initially it was 5 C words, which was connection, contemplation, curiosity, creativity, and compassion. Originally, actually, the curiosity piece was critical thinking because that was one of the things I didn't find welcome in some of those settings. So we knew we needed this. I knew kind of innately we needed a space like that where all those things were welcome and sort of encouraged and integrated. And so, just kind of grew really quickly to learn how to try to organize that and open that kind of a space up and see what happened. So
one of our probably our mutual acquaintance of Brian McLaren, he often talks about that congregations at their best should be schools of love.
Yes.
That, we should when we go to these communities or when we're part of them, ultimately we should be more loving, compassionate, all the C's, named, right? So, we're having this conversation as part of this online summit called Courageous Faith, but it's focused on the future of spirituality. And it seems like you maybe because of your experience with cancer and being invited kind of into that existential crisis moment, the dark night of the soul, if you will, at an early age, it maybe, and tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I wonder if it kind of freed you to face and to ask some more provocative questions about the future of faith and the future of spirituality and what was really needed. I really would like to know, okay, so what are the theological questions that now float in your head as we were thinking about the future of spirituality? And I ask that recognizing that institutional church has become so disappointing for so many people. And we're seeing, that there is this disconnect of those 5 C's that you've named. So what do you think? What are the big questions that we really need to address as a people building schools of love?
That's a wonderfully put. I think that's a great question. I think it's one that I'm hoping that more and more communities of faith are asking, because there's a theological dimension to that, which is, how have the theological concepts we've inherited reflected the colonialism from which they were birthed? And through that, what I mean is sort of like doing a rigorous power analysis of our concept of God and openly asking whether or not we want to continue to purport something like what we call the big O God of omnipotence and, omniscience and omnipresence, or, what other options are out there for us. Those of us who are interested in constructive or D/constructive models of God that are conversant with contemporary philosophy and cosmology and science, philosophy of science. So I do think there's a sort of an opening up that has already happened. I think some Christians still think that the conversation should be about whether or not God exists. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think those debates were being had in the 20th century, and we've sort of moved to a new register. And so there's that theological component. For me, one of those questions that opened up was I remember wondering, like, obviously with my experience of cancer, was like, a very deterministic sort of view of God would mean that sort of God planned this and caused this and all that kind of stuff. I was like, so divine action was a question that entered, very seriously early on. And the seminary I was at wasn't really engaging with that question philosophically and again, cosmologically tinged in any way that was meeting the questions I was carrying. So I think that's a big opening of, what kind of God could be active in the kind of universe we're coming to know. in this expansive cosmology and within quantum theory and everywhere in between. And then there's also this practical register of, what are all those ideas about something like God mean for the lived experience? Like you said, the sort of existential register for people, and how do we live out, if we did have something like faith in a God like is being opened up for us today, what would it look like to live into that flow, and how can we cooperate with and continue to move in beauty and benevolence with something like that? And so we could get into the particulars if you want of what I mean by some of that big God stuff, but I think generally we're having to reckon with a very colonial theology, and also ask ourselves seriously whether or not our claims about something like divine reality have anything to do with the universe we actually inhabit.
So I do want you to riff a little bit on decolonizing,
Okay.
Because I think that's I think it's essential. And I think you've got a really unique lens on it. So help us, what do you mean by that? And what are early ideas that people could hold or explore more to deepen their own understanding of the work?
Yeah, I would say that I try to stray from speaking in broad sweeping statements about large movements of history, but I do think Western Christianity, since something called the Constantinian shift in the 4th century, has really brought with it this very imperial understanding of God, which is, so for colonial purposes, what I mean is that I think it could be as simple as this for Christians, which is, I think there's something like the Great Commission, which is, go and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Why did we choose that as the Great Commission, right? Did it fit? Was it really the only mandate of Jesus of Nazareth or something like that? Or did it fit our colonial imagination to go and spread this to the world? I mean, why is the Great Commission not forgive 70 times 7? Why is the Great Commission not love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you? Why is the Great Commission not free the captives? You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of things we could have chosen, and yet we've inherited a very colonizing form of Christianity. So decolonizing is disentangling from the ways in which imperialism has gotten in bed with the Christian movement, and sort of, again, I would almost just go as far as to say is how power got in bed with the Christian movement. And that's what we're reckoning with in the form, I think, really of sort of like whiteness and late capitalism right now. And it is a moment of awakening, I think, for us too, especially those of us who, are white folks here in the West and practicing Christians. We've got to deal seriously with the harm that's been a part of that movement. So,
one of the questions that I've really wrestled with, or I continue to wrestle with, I'd love your opinion on, is our whole. So I'm a UCC pastor, so we share the congregational background, and the people watching this are coming from all different kinds of, probably mostly mainline Protestant traditions. Almost all of those, or actually probably all of those, were formed with that colonist mindset, and that with white or supremacy of whiteness built right into every bit of it. And I've really wrestled with, can that be undone? Or is it actually that we need to do kind of what you've done, which is create, alongside, but create something different, whose founding story really was mindfully against going down that road, What do you think? Can what we have be salvaged? And that's probably an unfair question, but I like your instinct about it.
My instinct is, I think that, so for what we name, like for us and at Way Collective, what we've named in our community is we want to carry the most loving and liberating parts of our tradition forward. And so I do think that at the heart of the Jesus movement, there is this loving and liberating pedagogy of how to live a human life. And I think that should be carried on. I will say though, however, that it's a struggle for communities to find a way forward, because we live in a time where so many folks have been traumatized by this form of Christianity that we're naming as a colonizing Christianity. And I recognize even in our own community this allergy to something like spiritual language, even now after being hurt by forms of church. I recognize from another side, there's an allergy to having to deal with whiteness and the shadow of whiteness in the church. So there's this confluence of it's a real struggle to try to create something that could be working in a different operational mode. And I mean that as sort of like as a community, and then to have to struggle into the nitty gritty of what does it look like for people to be decolonizing their own individual experience and thoughts, and then move together with cohesion as a group of people towards something more loving and liberating. I will say that like I have suspended judgments about that, but I think that the project is worth undertaking because the other option would be that we just leave Christianity behind. And I don't necessarily think that we need to. I mean, all of us who have grown up in something like church life have a spiritual technology. We have languages, we have practices. And I think that at a very core place, all of us want to be able to come home and to a safe home, to come home to a home where we can rest and be our fullest expression of ourselves and be called to love and liberation together as a people. And I still think Christianity has the potential to do that, but I want to just own and recognize that the struggle is deep, and it's mostly white folks who really need to be doing this work of decolonizing. So but it's hard, it's hard out there.
It is. And it's and it touches on the most base psychological egoic insecurities, our reptilian selves. It's just very deep work. I am interested in your incorporation or turn to mysticism. Because I think I'm seeing a rise of people exploring, wanting to reclaim the mystics. It's certainly been true in my own life. But is that part of the best of Christianity that could be carried forward, or what was that always part of your path, or how did that happen?
I think it is. I think it's to respond to your question. I do think it's part of the best of what can be carried forward, in part because I think the mystics through the ages have dealt seriously with the weakness of Jesus. And by that, I don't mean the inferiority of Jesus or anything like that. I just sort of mean that that there's a philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, who says that the brief Galilean vision of humility flickered through the ages while Christianity got in, concert with power. And so I do think that there's something to this mystical stream that invites us to a certain kind of inner posture of nonviolence, an inner posture of passivity. And by that, I don't mean passiveness in terms of a lived expression outwardly. I just mean it sort of like there's sort of this invitation to, this inner stance of least resistance to love, which is a surrender. It's a place of surrender. And so I'm much more interested in a spirituality that is about detachment and surrender to love than I am about one that wants to go crusade the world and make everybody reflect back to us our image. So there's that. And I also often think of, this quote from Dorothy Zella, who's a German liberation theologian, who says that our goal should be to erase the distinction between the mystical internal and the political external. And so this mutuality of inner transformation and social transformation, I think, go hand in hand. And so, I feel that in part the mystical stream is it's multifarious, right? It's itself a multiplicity. There's not one mystical path, but but the lineage tends toward the kind of, lived expression for human potential I think that we need right now.
Yeah. Yes. You and I could riff for hours actually on that. I wonder, when you think about the future of spirituality, what will be the animating image of God? It ties to the mystic question, but we'll get there. But
beauty.
What the animating image of God?
Beauty.
Beauty. Okay. Say more.
I think that well, there's a whole philosophical inheritance here of how we've been separated from beauty. I mean that in a very natural, organic way, that the sort of rampant materialist worldview that we've inherited and we learn in our graduate and undergraduate institutions has cut us off from the beauty of nature, and also our own inherent beauty as human beings. And so I find one of the most compelling ideas to in a theopoetic way, name the reality of God is as the manifold beauty of the universe. And I think what part of our project is, for those of us who are trying to chart a way forward for theology, is to help restore beauty to our common life. I think of von Balthasar, who said beauty was the one thing without which the ancient world refused to understand itself. And through some weird turns in philosophy in the Enlightenment era, beauty's been relegated to the eye of the beholder. And so beauty has moved from a cosmological value or reality that is just innate and natural in the world to cosmetology, how you organize yourself, or how one thinks that a certain shade or a certain work of art is beautiful, and it's only beautiful because it's that individual thinks that way about it. And so I think we need to recover the innateness of beauty, our experience of beauty, which again I think hits at the mystical register, and find a way forward together to ask questions about organizing society, which are what is most beautiful for most? What is this moment in history inviting us to cooperate in that could yield a more massive or intense experience of beauty for civilization and for the planet, And so for me, that's kind of where it's at right now,
I was just thinking, imagine an economic system built on the question, what is most beautiful for most?
Preach. Preach it, Cameron. Yep.
It would fundamentally reshape everything. And with that, help us recapture that sense of awe, which I think is native, is so intrinsic to what it means to be human.
Yeah.
To encounter that beauty beyond that of our understanding of it's at the individual level, that there's something that the beauty exists beyond that eye of the beholder. And in that we stand in awe.
Yeah. I think wonder, awe are primary modalities of being anything at all in this universe,
Yeah.
And I have a friend, Jose Francisco Morales Torres, who wrote his dissertation on wonder and the phenomenology of wonder, and how, for me, it's a fundamental reality for those of us who find ourselves drawn toward that interior life, that mystical experience, to say that we have to let ourselves be these unraveling phenomena of beauty. That's what we are just reaping and yielding beauty with every millisecond of our existence. And we've been sold so many, apparitions of beauty or falsifications or just shadows of beauty in our sort of commoditized world that we've got to recover the organic sense of that. And I do think that that's, kind of hearkening back to that passive flow of us settling into what I sometimes call coming back to our creatureliness
Mhm.
on some level.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. You're reminding me of my sense that as a culture, what we've created is we're trying to convince each other that, eating pablum, this tasteless, nasty, almost baby food, kind of that's sufficient sustenance, that that's actually what, the world should taste like. And
yeah.
it's a faded copy of what is so. So this invites for me then the question, because I'm not sure how convinced I am that institutional religion on the whole will be able to make this journey that we're talking about.
Yeah.
I hope it can. I think there's a great deal of gift in those systems that can shape our future. And I also am deeply invested in my own practice in learning or maturation of being, but then also in our collective. I'm interested in the ways in which rituals can accelerate or help us in this kind of expanding consciousness, that's happening. What are you learning about that? And what advice do you have for the rest of us on particularly as we think about future of spirituality and where this movement is headed?
That's a great question. I think as we move away from certain formats of churching together and we move towards something new, rituals often the first thing that sort of goes out the window, because so much of our experience of some of those rituals was totally like entangled in that colonial theology, and it's hard to come back to ritual after wanting to leave that behind. And yet I think you're right, it's vital. It's vital for our way forward. And that said, I do with you, Cameron, if grief is the primary ritual we need to keep now as we move through of transition, whatever the goal is. I think we need to create space for grief. Again, as we sort of disentangle from the throes of this late capitalist experience, as we are all subjects in this world. I think we need to create room for people to grieve those experiences. And then I think, there's sort of this, we can't be left in the throes of grief. We have to also move in loving kindness and compassion and healing as well. And so I think we need to sort of bring that together, again, especially in white communities, or centrally white communities who need to do this work of decolonizing. But we do this practice at Way Collective sometimes called grief, gratitude, grit, and grace. Just try to keep it, keep the alliterations flowing, but it's that thing of like, hey, let's in our pause moment, move through these movements of grief, and then gratitude for something, and then noticing the grit, the resilience that we all have to be living through a pandemic and through this season of Christianity, and then try to notice what grace is also there in the midst of our grief and this process, so that's the first thing that came to mind, but still learning.
I love it. So if I was to ask you the big ginormous question, what is the future of spirituality? Like, how would you respond to that? Particularly if you're a person who is serving, invested in an institutional space and wants to be part of that future. And even if it meant, letting go of what was, of owning that grief. What do we see? What do you see as the future of spirituality that gives a beacon to move toward?
Before I respond, could I ask you a question back? I mean,
You would be the first to do that, but I totally would be game for that.
Well, I just mean, what do you mean by spirituality would be one question I would have. And do you mean, what is the future of Christian spirituality? Are we talking about spirituality as some other umbrella comment? Because that might help me be able to hone a response in. Yeah,
that's good. And I can see now why you and Tripp are good friends, because that was exactly his question back to me on the conversation that we had. So for me, spirituality is the reclamation of the pursuit of the sacred. So that's why the mysticism stream of it matters so much to me, is that I sense and I see copious evidence for a deep yearning in the human soul, collective human soul, for an encounter with the sacred, or encounters with presence in that space. And that institutional religion has consistently, time and time again, failed to meet that yearning. And that more people in those spaces and outside of those spaces recognize that failure and wish to change. And so that to me gives me great hope. I also I really resonated with your statement of either we're able to decolonize this movement, to kind of right the movement, if you will, back to probably what I would think is a purer form, or a form with deeper integrity to Jesus' message and mission among us, than the forms of Christianity we see today. And the failure to do so would then mean that we'd need to just throw out Christianity because it would instead be a more toxic form of religion. It would be a force for ill, not for good in the world. So for me, we're right at that, kind of tipping point. So does that help?
It does, yeah. So I do think that, I think a first reflection would be that one of the dualisms or bifurcations we need to blow up is the sacred and the secular. So the first thing that came to mind when you sort of defined spirituality as this reclamation of the pursuit of the sacred was, I remember Richard Rohr saying one time that secularism is the definite and inevitable child of Christianity. And I thought, wow, does that mean that the sacred is disappearing, or is that another way to restore the sacred back into the world, to naturalize it once again? In fact, John Cobb, another theologian, says that we should secularize our Christianity. And what I think both of them are trying to hit at there is that we need to break down this division between the secular and the sacred, and find ways to turn our eyes back to a hurting world, a world in need. And so for me, I think that that's one overcoming of this inherent separation that we've inherited between us and nature. We could talk about us and other animalia and different, living things and systems on this planet. So I think the future of spirituality is we've got to overcome those dualisms and those bifurcations. And then, though, I also think that one of the themes that I don't hear talked about enough in contemplative circles is an author named Bayo Akomolafe's vision of fugitivity, that when we when this capitalist bubble ruptures for us, each of us has this experience of fugitivity, which again, I think for me, if you want to use a biblical image, harkens back to the wandering in the desert, the Exodus type experience, and that the future of spirituality will begin with us finding ways to be nomads, in a sense, together, and walking into this new land we don't know very well yet, because whiteness and late capitalism has gotten so deep down into us that it's hard for us to even pull our desire apart from the sort of commodified version of it. So again, breaking down this dualism of the sacred and the secular, I think turning the eyes of the sacred, like, what I meant by beauty is sort of like re-imbuing the sacred in the secular, and then walking together in this nomadic time and finding a way forward together through this rupture. But I do think that one of our challenges is to regress and just go back to what felt safe or normal, which could be easily sort of complicit in like a centrism that promotes the status quo in our forms of church and our Christian spirituality and our collective life. But I think the invitation to enter fugitivity is to enter the dark night, to release these clenches of power that have had their nails digging into this Christian movement, and then to kind of see what gets birthed. And I will say this, and this will be my last comment about this for now. There will not be one path. It will be a multiplicity. It won't be monolithic. There will be multiplicitous forms that will rise up and contrast and hopefully complement and create new relationships together. So
yeah. I want to just go on one more exploration with you, because I'm taking up a lot of your time, but
no, it's great.
The thing about the Dark Knight is that it becomes a disorientation sufficient enough that we actually lose our connection to the sacred, or our sense of connection, right? So it's this sense of deep abandonment, of alienation.
Yes.
I'm realizing in our conversation that I've made some assumptions about that I want to check with you, given your life experience and your grasp of this journey, that sense of abandonment is required to create in us an openness to trust the safety of the wondering.
Yes.
To trust the not knowing, like it makes the not knowing tolerable in the human experience. What do you think of this? Because if we're saying we're going through a collective dark night, then what it actually could indeed imply with the end of capitalism and privilege, et cetera, is a darkness that leads to a disconnect. Maybe, who knows, everybody's dark night is different, but St. John of the Cross taught us.
Well, and Jesus, on the cross, and I think the lineage is that you named it accurately, in that the core sense is abandonment. And I think on the theological front, what we're really talking about is losing God as an object of experience, as an object of our mind's understanding, having inherited this, post-Reformation theology that we have in Western Christianity here, that we could employ our rationality to somehow get it right and be certain, with the Spirit's confirmation in our heart, that these ideas that we've purported about God are correct. And again, in this sort of line of Meister Eckhart and St. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, I think also of, St. Teresa as well, that there's this core experience of having to let go of any kind of existential certainty, any kind of experience, ecstatic or otherwise spiritual experience of the divine, to confirm one's faith. And so what happens is we move away from this objectification of God into this naked, bare, painful, existential register of the finitude of the human experience. So for me, what that does in that theological move is invite us to begin to open ourselves to recognizing all the ways in which our pain, our struggle, our situatedness historically and societally are all actually sacred, just as they are, without any sort of spiritual transfiguration, without any sort of, I mean, I hope we've struggle towards societal and planetary liberation from systems of oppression. But what if we don't? Is there anything is there still a spiritual invitation to detach from, again, and to kind of move away from those modalities of needing something like, an object to satisfy our experience? Or is it, that the phenomena of our very lives are themselves expressions of beauty that live everlastingly as a part of this cosmic experience? And is that something to be cherished and wondered about and awestruck by? And is that the case no matter where we head? Civilization, in terms of a civilization or a planet? I tend to want to say that it is, and yet recognize the pain, recognize the suffering, recognize that invitation toward, kind of like, it's really a move from, again, seeing God as an object to just the subjectivity of your own life being this outpouring and overflow of sacredness that I think is a vital lifeline that we need to hang on to right now as we weather all that we're going through.
That at the end of the day, it's all one.
Sure.
That everything that is belongs in you. So, Tim, this was phenomenal. Thank you for your time.
Oh, that's so sweet of you to say. It's been wonderful to get to chat a bit. So.